We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Greetings mga ka-spacers! Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat. This is your ka-spacer and Space Commander Professor Jun Cajigal welcoming you to this episode of Space, the Final Frontier. So in this episode, we will continue with part 2 of the history of Project Apollo. So in this online lecture, we will be focusing on the Apollo missions. So mga ka-spacers, if we have any questions or comments or reactions later about this online lecture, please feel free to type in your questions, your comments, your reactions in our comment section below. Huwag po kayong mahiya and we will be very happy to answer all your questions and queries. And please like and share this online lecture so that we could inspire young minds to love the sciences, especially astronomy. Alright mga ka-spacers, so let us continue with part 2 of the history of Project Apollo. Good evening mga ka-spacers and welcome to part 2 of our online lecture on the history of Project Apollo. Now, with the success of the Gemini manned space program, NASA was confident of putting men on the moon and returning them safely to the Earth, acquiring all the skills that they gained from Project Gemini. So with that, NASA proceeded with Project Apollo. Now, the purpose of Project Apollo was to land men on the lunar surface and to return them safely to the Earth. This is in fulfillment with the challenge of President John F. Kennedy. So to start with the Apollo program, NASA proceeded with Apollo 1. Now in Apollo 1, we have two veteran Gemini astronauts, Ed White and Gus Grissom, and there was a newbie by the name of Roger Chaffee. So Ed White, that's the commander of Apollo 1, pilot Virgil Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee. And unfortunately, these three astronauts were killed in a fire in the command module. So nakakalungkot lang kasi Apollo 1 pa naman ito, and at the start of the Apollo program, namatay itong tatlong astronauts sa sunog inside the command module of the Saturn V. So here we have Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and here is Roger Chaffee. Alright, and here is a photo of that command module that was burned, and inside were the three astronauts. So this was the burned command module of Apollo 1, and these are the charred remains of the three astronauts. So here is Virgil Gus Grissom, his remains. At the middle we have Ed White, and here we have the remains of Roger Chaffee. So nakakalungkot lang, nagsisimula pa lang ang Project Apollo, ganito na ang nangyari sa Apollo 1. Astronauts die in a fiery capsule na naging headlines sa mga dyaryo noon. So it's quite unfortunate. Alright, so because of that, there was no Apollo 2 and Apollo 3. Apollo 2 and 3 were actually called Apollo Saturn 202 and 203. And these were unmanned launches using the Saturn 1B rocket. So at this point, mga ka-spacers, let's watch this video about what happened to Apollo 1. Alright mga ka-spacers, let's watch this.
Hey, how are we gonna get to the moon if we can't talk between three buildings? I can't hear a thing you're saying. Jesus Christ.
The Apollo 1 crew were sealed inside their command module, conducting a dress rehearsal of the launch countdown. The test had been halted by constant communications problems, and command pilot Gus Grissom was becoming frustrated. Grissom was one of America's most experienced astronauts. He was a member of NASA's first astronaut group, the Mercury 7, who launched into space aboard tiny one-person capsules. His senior pilot was Ed White, the first American to walk in space. With them was rookie astronaut Roger Chaffee, a former spy plane pilot who flew reconnaissance missions during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Under enormous pressure to land an astronaut on the moon by the end of the decade, NASA and its contractors had rushed the design of the complex Apollo spacecraft. Even after 5 years of development and testing, it was still riddled with defects. During ground tests, astronauts struggled with coolant leaks, problems with the plumbing in the environmental system, and short circuits in the 20 miles of electrical wiring that filled the spacecraft. The crew were getting ready to resume the countdown.
Can you get him out of there? Buzz, can you read us?
Within moments, flames ripped through the capsule, killing all 3 astronauts. Precisely how the fire started was never determined. But it was most likely a spark from damaged wiring, somewhere in the lower equipment bay. The atmosphere inside the command module was pure oxygen, and in this environment, even materials that were normally fire-resistant burst into flame. Within seconds, the spacecraft became an incinerator. The design of the spacecraft's heavy, multi-piece hatch made escape impossible. The inner hatch was fixed in place with 6 large bolts, which had to be manually unscrewed with a wrench. Even if the bolts could have been removed in time, the hatch opened inwards, and so it was sealed shut by the high pressure inside the capsule. The risks of spaceflight were well understood at NASA, but Grissom, White, and Chaffee did not die during a rocket launch or in orbit. They died on the ground during a routine test with help close at hand.
So mga ka-spacers, this was really a tragic event for NASA. Napakalaking dagok ito sa NASA and the manned space program sa pagkamatay nila Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee inside the command module of the Apollo spacecraft. This was really a blow sa NASA. But they didn't die in vain. So they have learned a lot, and because of their death, they made lots of improvements and modifications dun sa command module ng Apollo spacecraft para hindi na maulit ang ganyang pangyayari. So they made lots of modifications and improvements in the Apollo spacecraft. Alright, so here is a photo of the Saturn 1B rocket. Alright, then after Apollo 2 and 3 unmanned launches, NASA proceeded with Apollo 4. Apollo 4 was the first unmanned test flight of the mighty Saturn V launch vehicle, which was used by the US Apollo program to send the first astronauts to the moon.
Apollo 4 was launched on November 9, 1967 at noon UTC from Launch Complex 39A at Cape Canaveral. It was the first test flight of the mighty Saturn V, the largest rocket ever launched. After the Apollo 1 disaster in January of the year, the program had essentially been stalled in the midst of the investigation. While crewed space flights would still have to wait another 11 months before resuming with Apollo 7, this uncrewed launch kept the Apollo program on track, or as much as it could be, given the circumstances. Technically, this test was a year late, but considering the difficulties in developing such a rocket, that was understandable. Also, in the wake of Apollo 1, the command module on this mission was found to have many defects, especially bad wiring, and fixing those took 4 months. Unlike many first tests of rocket systems before it, the Apollo spacecraft and service module and all stages of the rocket were fully functional. Not only that, but the third stage placed itself into low Earth orbit and then relit just as it would for a transfer to the moon. Instead of making an actual lunar transfer though, it got itself to an apoapsis above 17,000 kilometers and a periapsis of negative 200 kilometers, ensuring a fiery demise. After that, the Apollo command and service module separated and did 2 service module burns of its own, roughly simulating a lunar orbit insertion and Earth return burn, placing itself on a return orbit with a re-entry speed equivalent to that which would be experienced when returning from the moon. The entire mission was successful and the Apollo spacecraft splashed down as planned near its recovery ship. During the mission, the second stage had cameras to record the separation of the first stage to ensure that happened correctly, ejecting the cameras for recovery shortly after the staging. That recording of the staging is often used in Apollo media. The command module also had a camera that photographed Earth. Apollo 4 relieved a lot of the pressure on the program after the tragedy of Apollo 1, but its success was a bit deceptive, as the agency would learn in the second launch of Saturn V, Apollo 6. With that, thank you for watching this mission profile of Apollo 4.
So mga ka-spacers, with the success of Apollo 4, NASA proceeded with Apollo 5. Now, Apollo 5 was the first unmanned flight of the Apollo Lunar Module or LM, or Lunar Excursion Module or LEM, which would later carry astronauts to the lunar surface. The lunar module was lifted off on January 22, 1968 with a Saturn 1B rocket on an Earth orbital flight. So yung Saturn 1B, ito yung smaller version ng Saturn 5. So ginamit ito sa Apollo 2 and Apollo 3.
Apollo 5 was launched on January 22, 1968 at 10:48 p.m. UTC from Launch Complex 37B at Cape Canaveral. This mission was the first uncrewed test of the lunar module, the lander that would eventually allow astronauts to set foot on the moon. Lunar Module 1 was placed into low Earth orbit by the Saturn 1B launcher, which was also used for Earth orbit tests of the Apollo Command and Service Module. Placed into a fairly low orbit, 222 kilometers by 167 kilometers, the lunar module would re-enter on its own after a while, but not before it went through a series of tests. Unlike the model in the video, LEM-1 was launched without landing legs. This in-space test of the lunar module had been delayed because of struggles at Grumman, which was after all trying to build something entirely new. In fact, even after LEM-1 had been mated to its adapter for launch, word came in that a window on another LEM, the one that would eventually be launched on Apollo 11, failed during a pressurization test. So, the windows on this launch were replaced with aluminum plates until a redesign could be worked out. After separating from the rocket and coasting for a couple of orbits, the lunar module was supposed to conduct a 39-second burn with its descent engine. This would be the first time that a properly throttling engine was fired in orbit. However, the computer shut down the engine early because it was not reading the proper thrust from the engine. Turns out that the engine was just taking longer to get started because, due to concerns while readying the vehicle, in particular because of concerns that there might be a fuel leak, NASA decided not to arm the system ahead of time. However, the programmers had not been made aware of this change in the plans, so the program did not factor in the delay in the ignition. So, Mission Control fired the descent engine manually and the test was successful. They also fired it again to check it out a second time because it does have restart capability. And then they also fired the ascent engine while the ascent stage was still connected to the descent stage, the so-called fire in the hole test, because that would be how the engine started in actual practice, and they wanted to make sure nothing structurally strange happened during such a start, which might cause a bad separation from the descent stage. The two stages of the lunar module re-entered separately, with the ascent stage burning up after 2 days, and the descent stage coming back into the atmosphere on February 12th. The test was considered successful despite the issues, and NASA decided that another uncrewed test would not be necessary. So the next time a lunar module would fly, it would be on Apollo 9, with the crew testing it directly. Thank you for watching this mission profile of Apollo 5.
So with the success of Apollo 5, NASA realized that they need to continue further testing of the mighty Saturn V rocket. So NASA proceeded with Apollo 6. Apollo 6 was the second all-up unmanned test of the mighty Saturn V rocket. Then when all systems are go, NASA proceeded with Apollo 7. Now, Apollo 7's objective was to perform a full in-space manned test of the main Apollo spacecraft and its equipment on board. So we have here a veteran of the Mercury and the Gemini space program, Walter Schirra. Then we have Eisel and Cunningham. So those were the astronauts of Apollo 7. Kaya lang may nangyari dito sa Apollo 7. So yung mga astronauts dito, nagkaroon sila ng sipon, nagkaroon sila ng colds. The 3-man crew all came down with heads cold, which causes nasal congestion, headaches, and runny nose. So, nagkasipon yung mga astronauts ng Apollo 7. Needless to say, the astronauts weren't at all their best and got a little snappy with mission control. So siguro dahil masama ang pakiramdam nila, medyo uminit ng ulo ng mga Apollo 7 astronauts. And as a result, nagkaroon ng tinatawag na space mutiny. They got a little snappy with mission control. So naging parang suplado sila sa mission control. And as a result, NASA did not invite any of the men back for future space flights. And to add mga ka-spacers dun sa space mutiny na nangyari sa Apollo 7 dahil nagkaroon lahat sila ng sipon at medyo uminit yung ulo nila sa mission control, hindi maganda rin yung kanilang pagdating dito sa Earth. Apollo 7 landed in the Atlantic Ocean upside down, as you could see in our photo. Ganyan ang landing ng Apollo 7 and ayaw yan ng NASA. The astronauts hung from their restraining belts for a few minutes before 3 inflated bags were activated to flip the spacecraft. So ayan po nangyari sa Apollo 7. Alright, so to further clarify and so that you would really appreciate what happened to Apollo 7, let's watch this video about Apollo 7. Okay mga ka-spacers, let's watch this.
Learning from the failures that caused the Apollo 1 fire, NASA redesigned the Apollo spacecraft. The new Block 2 model had fireproof wiring and spacesuits made with non-flammable cloth. At launch, the capsule was pressurized with a safer oxygen-nitrogen mix, and its new single-piece hatch could be opened in just 7 seconds. The lunar module was still in the design phase and would be tested on later flights. The Apollo 7 crew had been the Apollo 1 backups. Like Gus Grissom, Mission Commander Wally Schirra had been part of the original Mercury 7 astronaut corps. Their mission was to give the new Apollo spacecraft a thorough shakedown.
5, 4, 3, 2, we have ignition. Commit liftoff. We have liftoff.
Schirra and his crew put the Apollo spacecraft through its paces for the first time. They performed navigation exercises and practiced docking maneuvers, using their spent rocket booster as a target. Apollo 7 accomplished all its objectives. The mission was a success. The Apollo program was back on track. And its next step would truly be a giant leap.
So mga ka-spacers, with the success of Apollo 7, NASA was confident of the hardware that would bring men to the moon. NASA proceeded with Apollo 8. Now, the crew of Apollo 8 includes Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. They were both veterans of the Gemini program, and William or Bill Anders. Now, Apollo 8 was the second human spaceflight mission in the United States Apollo space program, and it was launched on December 21, 1968. And Apollo 8, mga ka-spacers, became the first crewed spacecraft to leave the Earth's orbit, reach the Earth's moon, orbit it, and return safely to the Earth. Now mga ka-spacers, did you know that this was not the original mission plan of Apollo 8? Now, the original mission plan of Apollo 8 was to test the lunar module and the command module in an elliptical medium Earth orbit in early 1969. But the mission profile of Apollo 8 was changed in August of 1968 to a more ambitious command module only lunar orbital flight to be flown in December. Now the question is why? Why the sudden change in its mission plan? Now this is because of a photograph taken by a U.S. reconnaissance satellite in Russia. Now, a U.S. reconnaissance satellite photographed the N1 rocket of the Russians on the pad shortly before its rollback to the assembly building, as you could see in our picture here. NASA Administrator James Webb had access to this and other similar intelligence that showed that the Russians were seriously planning manned lunar mission. Now mga ka-spacers, itong N1 rocket, ito ay halos kasing laki ng Saturn V. And when the NASA administrators and other officials saw this photograph, medyo natakot na, nasindak ang NASA. And they were afraid that the Russians may beat the Americans to the moon. So, minadali ngayon nila. That's why the mission plan of Apollo 8 was changed. So, mga ka-spacers, here is the modified mission plan of Apollo 8. Its goal, to go to the moon, make at least 10 orbits around the moon, and return safely to Earth. There was no lunar landing because the lunar module was not yet ready for such a task. So this was only a command module lunar orbital flight. Apollo 8 was launched on December 21 of 1968 after making several orbits around the Earth to test the efficiency of the command module. They made a trans-lunar injection on their way to the moon. It took them at least 3 days to reach the moon, and on December 24 of 1968, upon reaching the moon, they made a lunar orbit insertion. So they made at least several orbits around the moon. And on December 25, Christmas Day of 1968, they made a trans-Earth injection on their way back to Earth. Then the Apollo 8 made a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean on December 27 of 1968. So let's take a look at some photos of Apollo 8. So here is a photo of the crew of Apollo 8. So we have here Frank Borman. At the middle is William Bill Anders. And this is Jim Lovell. And here is a photo of the cockpit of the command module of Apollo 8. And when the Apollo 8 spacecraft came out from behind the moon for its fourth pass across the front, the crew of Apollo 8, mga ka-spacers, witnessed an Earthrise in person for the first time in human history. Anders saw the Earth emerging from behind the lunar horizon and called in excitement to the others, as you could see here in our GIF photo, taking a black and white photograph as he did so. Anders asked Lovell for color film and took Earthrise, which is now a famous color photo, later picked by Life magazine as one of the 100 photos of the century. So that's the famous Earthrise photo of Apollo 8. Alright mga ka-spacers, so isn't that fascinating? Here is that famous Earthrise photo of Apollo 8. Alright, so at this point mga ka-spacers, let's watch this short video of Apollo 8. Alright mga ka-spacers, let's watch this.
In April 1968, a CIA report suggested that the Soviet Union was about to send cosmonauts around the moon. To stop the Soviets beating America to another first, Apollo 8, originally intended as a test of the lunar module in Earth orbit, would instead be sent on a mission to orbit the moon. The furthest any human had travelled from the surface of the Earth was 850 miles. Apollo 8's crew would travel 240,000 miles from home, with no hope of rescue if their spacecraft failed. The mission commander was Frank Borman, an Air Force colonel, test pilot and aeronautical engineer. His command module pilot was Jim Lovell, who knew Borman better than most. On Gemini 7, the two men spent a record-breaking and grueling 14 days orbiting the Earth in a tiny spacecraft. Joining them was Bill Anders. His job would be to survey the moon's surface for future landing sites. Travelling to the moon required the largest rocket NASA had ever designed. Borman, Lovell and Anders would be the first astronauts to ride the mighty Saturn V.
We have commit. We have liftoff.
At over 110 meters tall, it dwarfed all previous American rockets. Its 5 enormous F1 engines burned through 500,000 gallons of kerosene and liquid oxygen in just 2.5 minutes, delivering a combined thrust of 7.5 million pounds. The second and third stages carried the spacecraft to Earth orbit and onwards to the moon. It took the Apollo 8 crew 3 days to travel to the moon. But they did not fly alone. Like all Apollo missions, Apollo 8 was carefully managed from the Mission Operations Control Room in Houston, Texas, popularly known as Mission Control. Teams of flight controllers operated round the clock, overseeing the spacecraft's trajectory and every one of its onboard systems. All voice communications to the spacecraft passed through the Capsule Communicator, or Capcom, a position always filled by a fellow astronaut. The flight director had overall responsibility for the mission, and the final say in every decision. When Apollo 8 reached the moon, the crew had to fire their large SPS engine to slow down and be captured by the moon's gravity. If the engine didn't fire for precisely the correct amount of time, Apollo 8 could crash into the moon or be hurled into deep space. It was impossible to communicate with the crew whilst they were behind the moon. The staff at Mission Control waited nervously for news.
Apollo 8, Houston, over. Go ahead, Houston, Apollo 8.
We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit.
Borman, Lovell and Anders were the first humans to view the lunar surface close up. But the most incredible thing they saw was their home planet. On the third orbit, Anders captured one of history's most remarkable photos, Earthrise. The image was peaceful, but 1968 had been a difficult year for the United States. The nation was bitterly divided over the war in Vietnam. Black Americans were still fighting for their civil rights. Martin Luther King was assassinated in April, and Bobby Kennedy in June. But for NASA at least, the success of Apollo 8 brought hope. For the first time, it seemed possible they might meet President Kennedy's goal and land an astronaut on the moon before the end of the decade.
So mga ka-spacers, I hope you liked that video of Apollo 8. And I hope you would realize that NASA really took a great risk in sending Apollo 8 to the moon, considering they are not really prepared and they were not confident of the hardware that would enable men to go to the moon and to return safely to Earth. But they did. Apollo 8 was able to reach the moon, made several orbits, and returned safely to Earth. So technically, Apollo 8 was the first to the moon, and they have already beaten the Russians to the moon. So that was Apollo 8. Then with the success of Apollo 8, NASA proceeded with Apollo 9. The crew of Apollo 9 was McDivitt, Scott, and Schweikart. The mission of Apollo 9 was a full crew testing of the lunar module in low Earth orbit, including the ability to rendezvous with the command service module. Actually, ito dapat yung mission ng Apollo 8. Pero pinasa na lang nila ito sa Apollo 9. Alright, and here is a photo of that testing of the lunar module in low Earth orbit.
In the wake of Apollo 8's daring journey to the moon, Apollo 9 received much less public attention. The mission wasn't even going to leave Earth orbit. But within the astronaut corps, the first crewed flight of the lunar module was seen as an even more exciting challenge. The mission's commander, Jim McDivitt, had actually turned down the chance to fly to the moon on Apollo 8, choosing Apollo 9 instead. Like many Apollo astronauts, he was a former test pilot, and this was a chance to test a brand new flying machine.
2, 1, 0. Liftoff. We have liftoff at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Before the test flight of the lunar module could begin, the crew had a challenging docking maneuver to perform. The lunar module was folded inside the upper stage of the Saturn V rocket and needed to be extracted using the command and service module.
Roger, Houston, we're about 25 feet now on the closing point. All right, Houston, we're hard back. Good go.
Leaving Command Module pilot Dave Scott to fly the CSM, McDivitt and Lunar Module pilot Rusty Schweikart climbed aboard and undocked. The Lunar Module was the first true spaceship designed only to fly in the vacuum of space. Its insect-like body was designed without the constraints of aerodynamics, but every panel, bolt and button had to be as light as possible, so the craft could lift itself off the moon's surface. McDivitt said that it looked like cellophane and tinfoil put together with scotch tape and staples. He gave his craft the call sign Spider. Unlike the command module, Spider did not have a heat shield, so it would burn up if it tried to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. So, if the astronauts couldn't re-dock with the command module after their test flight, they would have no way of returning home. But Spider's test flight went perfectly. McDivitt and Schweikart flew the lunar module over 100 miles from the command module. They tested the ascent and descent engines and returned for a safe rendezvous. The lunar module was ready to fly to the moon.
So with the successful testing of the lunar module in low Earth orbit, NASA proceeded with Apollo 10. The crew of Apollo 10 includes Eugene Cernan, John Young, and Thomas Stafford. The mission of Apollo 10 was a dress rehearsal for the more famous Apollo 11 landing, designed to test all of procedures and equipment needed to land on the moon. So nagpa-practice na sila na mag-landing sa buwan. This was a dress rehearsal already for Apollo 11's famous lunar landing. That was the mission of Apollo 10. It was already a dress rehearsal, testing all the procedures and equipment needed to land on the moon. So ayan na, nagre-ready na ang NASA to land on the moon. And one in particular still stands out of Apollo 10's mission was at that time a couple pieces of fecal matter free floated around the command module for several minutes. So sa mission ng Apollo 10 sa command module may lumutang na fecal matter. So yun yung mga unusual occurrences sa Apollo 10. So pieces of fecal matter floated around the command module. Kaya lang hindi nila matrace kung kanino yung fecal matter na yan.
NASA had successfully tested both the command module and lunar module and made a trip around the moon. Many hoped the next mission would attempt the first moon landing. But NASA needed more experience in communications and tracking two separate spacecraft in lunar orbit, plus the challenges of rendezvous and docking in the moon's weaker gravity. And there was another critical unknown. In 1968, NASA scientists discovered that the moon has a highly uneven gravitational field. This is caused by huge lumps of high-density material in its crust, known as mass concentrations, or mascons, which could exert an uneven pull on a spacecraft and throw it off course. Before it was safe to attempt a landing, NASA would need to learn more about the mascons by examining their effect on another Apollo flight. Apollo 10 would be a dress rehearsal for the first landing attempt, flying every part of the mission, except for the final descent to the surface. The Apollo 10 crew was Commander Tom Stafford, Command Module Pilot John Young, and Lunar Module Pilot Gene Cernan. All three men were veterans of the Gemini program, and with 5 missions between them, they were the most experienced crew ever sent into space. Stafford and Cernan flew the lunar module to within 9 miles of the moon's surface. Their successful flight proved every phase of the mission, except for the final descent. Now, everything was in place. It was time to attempt the landing.
Now, with the successful dress rehearsal of Apollo 10, NASA was confident of sending men to the moon, land on its surface, and to return the astronauts safely to the Earth. So with that, NASA proceeded now with the famous Apollo 11 lunar landing. Now, the crew of Apollo 11 included Neil Armstrong, a veteran of Gemini 8, Buzz Aldrin, a veteran of Gemini 12, and Michael Collins, a veteran of Gemini 10. Now, Neil Armstrong was the commander, Michael Collins was the command module pilot, and Buzz Aldrin was the lunar module pilot. And Apollo 11 was launched on July 16 of 1969 on board the Saturn V rocket. Then on July 20 of 1969, Apollo 11 successfully lands on the moon at the Sea of Tranquility. Neil Armstrong made his first steps on the lunar surface, uttering the famous words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." So here is a photo taken by Neil Armstrong. That's Buzz Aldrin moving down the ladder of the lunar module. And the Apollo 11 crew successfully planted the American flag on the lunar surface. And here is Buzz Aldrin. This photo was taken by Neil Armstrong. And they planted or they installed several instruments on the lunar surface. And here is a photograph of the Earth rising over the moon's horizon. This was taken by Michael Collins of Apollo 11 Command Service Module in July of 1969. So that was the famous Apollo 11 lunar landing. So at this point, mga ka-spacers, let's watch this video of the successful lunar landing of Apollo 11. Alright mga ka-spacers, let's watch this!
Ding. Apollo 11 would be commanded by Neil Armstrong, a brilliant engineer and test pilot. Early in his NASA career, he'd flown the experimental X-15 rocket plane, up to an altitude of 207,000 feet, at speeds of almost 4,000 miles per hour. When he joined the space program as part of NASA's second astronaut group, he was one of the few astronauts to be offered a command on his first mission, Gemini 8. Gemini 8 achieved the first docking of 2 spacecraft in orbit. But the mission almost ended in disaster when a faulty maneuvering thruster caused the Gemini capsule to spin wildly. Armstrong's calm and swift piloting brought the spacecraft under control, and although the mission was cut short, he'd proved his almost superhuman ability to remain calm under pressure. Joining him as lunar module pilot was Buzz Aldrin. A graduate of MIT, Aldrin wrote his doctoral thesis on piloting techniques for orbital rendezvous, and had an extraordinary understanding of orbital mechanics. He'd proven his expertise on Gemini 12. When the spacecraft's rendezvous radar malfunctioned, he was able to compute the orbital maneuvers himself and guide the capsule to a successful docking with an unmanned target rocket. The command module pilot was Michael Collins. He would remain aboard the command module, whilst Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the moon. He had no regrets about his assignment, telling reporters that he was going 99.9% of the way there, and that was fine with him. But years later, he would recount his greatest fear, that Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded on the surface, leaving him to travel back to Earth alone. The 15th of July, 1969. Almost 1 million people were gathering at Cape Kennedy to watch the 3 astronauts fly to the moon. But not everyone was there to celebrate. As launch preparations were made, around 150 people, mostly African-American mothers and their children, arrived at Cape Kennedy to protest the launch. They were led by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who had succeeded Dr. Martin Luther King as leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference after King's assassination the previous year. Their message was simple. It was inhuman to spend billions of dollars sending men to the moon, while 1 in 5 Americans lacked proper food, shelter and health care. NASA Administrator Thomas Paine met with the protesters the evening before the launch. He told Abernathy that if we could solve the problems of poverty by not pushing the button to launch men to the moon tomorrow, then we would not push that button. Their terse meeting resolved nothing, but it ended with a handshake and a promise by Abernathy that he would pray for the safe flight of the astronauts. The following day, 10 of the protesters were invited into the VIP stands to watch the launch of Apollo 11.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
4 days later, on the 20th of July, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into their lunar module, call sign Eagle, and began their descent to the lunar surface.
Eagle has wings.
Years of hard work and training had led to this moment. The descent to the lunar surface would test their skills to the very limit. Back on Earth, in Houston, Texas, the staff of Mission Control watched as Eagle passed behind the moon for a final time. They monitored every system in both spacecraft and guided the astronauts through the complex flight plan. And the success of the mission was about to rest on the shoulders of 26-year-old guidance officer Steve Bales.
1202, standing by. 1202.
The master alarm sounded in the lunar module cockpit. Eagle's guidance computer was trying to tell the astronauts that something was wrong. Its simple display showed the numbers 1202, but neither Armstrong or Aldrin knew what this meant. Flight Director Gene Kranz was seconds away from calling an abort. He turned to Bales for answers. 1202 meant the guidance computer was overloaded. It had too many tasks to complete in its computing cycle, and was dropping some in order to continue functioning. Without a working guidance computer, the astronauts would have to abort. But the alarm wasn't sounding continuously. This meant that most computational cycles were being completed properly. Bales decided that as long as the problem was only intermittent, the landing could continue.
We're going that flight. If it doesn't reoccur, we'll be go.
But then, another problem. The lunar module was approaching the surface too fast, and had overshot its intended landing site. Now the computer was guiding them towards a massive, football stadium-sized crater, surrounded by a field of car-sized boulders. With the lunar module almost out of fuel, Armstrong took manual control. Mission Control could only watch. The landing rested on Armstrong's piloting skills.
60 seconds. Lights on. 4 forward, drifter to the right a little. Down a half. 30 seconds forward drift. Contact light. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
As around 600 million people watched from Earth, Armstrong took his first steps on the lunar surface.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The precisely choreographed moonwalk had taken 2 years to plan. For 2 hours and 40 minutes, Armstrong and Aldrin gathered rock samples, set up scientific experiments, and took photographs. The Apollo 11 crew returned home as heroes. Their names now amongst those of the greatest explorers in history.
So with the success of the Apollo 11 lunar landing, NASA had already fulfilled the challenge of John F. Kennedy to send man to the moon, land on its surface, and to return the astronauts safely to the Earth. The Americans had already beaten the Russians to the moon, and they have already won the space race. But NASA didn't stop there. NASA continued with Apollo 12. Now, the crew of Apollo 12 included Charles P. Conrad, he was the commander, then Richard F. Gordon Jr., the command module pilot, and Alan Bean, he was the lunar module pilot. And unlike the first landing of Apollo 11, Conrad and Bean achieved a precise landing at their expected location. That's the site of the Surveyor 3 unmanned probe, which landed on April 20 of 1967. So here is a photo of the Surveyor 3 unmanned probe, right? And that's the mission of Apollo 12. And you could see the lunar module at the background, and you have here the Surveyor unmanned probe.
Apollo 12 would aim to land next to the Surveyor 3 probe, which had been on the moon since 1967. If NASA could hit this precise target, they'd prove that a pinpoint landing was possible. Apollo 12's crew was Mission Commander Pete Conrad, Command Module Pilot Dick Gordon, and Lunar Module Pilot Alan Bean. They were a tight-knit crew who drove matching gold Corvettes to work at Kennedy Space Center. Conrad and Gordon had already flown together on Gemini 11, and all three men had been stationed at the United States Naval Test Pilot School at Patuxent River, Maryland. But their mission almost didn't make it into orbit.
6.
As the countdown reached 0, huge thunderclouds loomed overhead.
0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff.
The colossal Saturn V rocket and its exhaust trail were acting as a gigantic lightning rod. Two lightning strikes shut down the service module's fuel cells and knocked out the command module's guidance system. But nobody had seen the strikes. All they could see was a barrage of errors and warnings.
I got 3 fuel cell lights, an AC bus light, a fuel cell disconnect, AC bus overload, 1 and 2, main bus A and B out.
In Mission Control, Flight Director Jerry Griffin was moments from calling an abort. But a young flight controller named John Aaron was able to interpret the chaotic data and come up with a solution. With no time to explain, he relayed an obscure instruction to the crew.
Apollo 12 Houston, try SCE to auxiliary, over. NCE to auxiliary. SCE to auxiliary.
The command was so obscure that neither the flight director or Conrad had any idea what it meant. But in the lunar module pilot's seat, Alan Bean understood Aaron's solution. He switched to a set of backup electronics that had escaped the lightning strike, and the mission was back on track.
I'm not sure we can get hit by lightning.
The problem had been diagnosed and fixed within moments. It was a testament to the rigorous training of the astronauts and mission control staff. The crew of Apollo 12 continued their journey to the moon and made a safe landing. When Pete Conrad set foot on the lunar surface, his first words lacked Neil Armstrong's gravitas, but he more than made up for it with his delight.
Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me. I'm going to step off the pad. What is that soft and green?
As he looked around the landing site, he saw that their mission had been accomplished.
That's what I see sitting on the side of the crater. Little surveyor, huh? Little surveyor, yes sir. It can't be any further than 600 feet from here. How about that?
Apollo 12 had made its pinpoint landing next to the Surveyor 3 probe. It was located in Oceanus Procellarum, also known as the Ocean of Storms. Now, NASA had sent astronauts to the moon 4 times, including 2 successful landings. But if lunar flight was starting to look routine, the next Apollo mission would be a terrifying reminder of the dangers of spaceflight.
So with the success of Apollo 12, NASA continued with its Apollo lunar program with Apollo 13. Now, the crew of Apollo 13 included Fred Hayes, then we have Jim Lovell, a veteran of Apollo 8, and Mattingly supposedly, but medical doctors thought that Mattingly has the measles, so he was replaced by Jack Swigert. So that was now the crew of Apollo 13. So you have Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert. Now, Apollo 13 was considered as a successful failure. Why? So here in Apollo 13, you have the command module with the code name Odyssey, and the lunar module with the code name Aquarius. So what happened to Apollo 13 was that an oxygen tank exploded after the cryosphere of Jack Swigert. And because of that explosion, there was a shortage of electrical power and oxygen. And because of that emergency, they have to power down the command module Odyssey, and they have to transfer to the lunar module Aquarius. The lunar module became the lifeboat of Apollo 13. Now, right after the explosion of the oxygen tank as a result of the cryosphere, Jim Lovell uttered these famous words to Mission Control: "Houston, we had a problem." Now, to save on power and life support, the astronauts must power down the command module Odyssey, and they have to transfer to the lunar module Aquarius. The lunar module Aquarius became the lifeboat of the Apollo 13 astronauts. And here is a photo of the service module of the command module Odyssey. So you will notice that a panel was lost due to the explosion of the oxygen tank. So after the oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon, the crew of Apollo 13 and the NASA scientists in Houston are forced to abandon the plan to land on the moon, and there was no lunar landing, and instead just get the men home without killing them. Through days of hard work, they succeeded. So that's the reason why Apollo 13 was a successful failure. They were successful in bringing the Apollo 13 crew back to Earth, but they failed to land on the moon. Now at this point, mga ka-spacers, let's watch this short video of what happened to Apollo 13. Alright mga ka-spacers, let's watch this.
The third lunar landing attempt marked a shift in the Apollo program. Previous missions had largely been test flights of the spacecraft. Apollo 13 would focus on scientific discovery. It would land at the Fra Mauro Highlands, whose ancient terrain could provide insight into the origins of the solar system. Adapting a motto from the US Naval Academy, the mission patch features the words "Ex Luna Scientia," from the moon, knowledge. But before the crew of Apollo 13 reached the moon, a disaster would leave them fighting for their lives. The mission commander was veteran astronaut Jim Lovell, who had travelled further and spent more time in space than any other astronaut. Between his Gemini 7 flight with Frank Borman, his Gemini 12 flight with Buzz Aldrin, and his trip around the moon on Apollo 8, he'd spent 572 hours in space, and travelled almost 7 million miles. He was joined by 2 rookie astronauts, Lunar Module pilot Fred Hayes and Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly. But just 2 days before launch, Ken Mattingly was grounded after being exposed to German measles, and replaced by another astronaut, Jack Swigert. Swigert was considered an excellent pilot, but the last-minute change was a difficult blow for a crew that had trained so intensely together.
This is the crew of Apollo 13. Wish everybody there a nice evening, and we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back to a pleasant evening at Odyssey.
The Apollo 13 crew had just completed a live TV broadcast on their way to the moon. But it went no further than mission control. With public interest in the Apollo program fading, no US TV network would carry their show. As the astronauts packed away their camera equipment, there were a few housekeeping procedures to take care of.
13, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like you to clear up your cryo tank.
The Command and Service Module was powered by 3 fuel cells that generated electricity by mixing hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen was stored as a very cold liquid in 2 storage tanks. In zero gravity, the temperature and density of the oxygen could become uneven in different areas of the tank, which made it difficult to measure how much was left. The solution was to stir the liquid oxygen with a fan. During a ground test just a few weeks earlier, a heater inside oxygen tank number 2 was accidentally left on, and its interior was baked to over 500 degrees Celsius. This damaged the Teflon insulation around the wires leading to the fan. When Jack Swigert turned that fan on, electrical current arced across the wires, starting a fire. The pressure of expanding gas turned the oxygen tank into a bomb.
Okay, we're still the world overhead. We got more than a problem. Okay, one. Two pressure. I don't know what it is.
As the staff at Mission Control frantically tried to understand what had happened to the spacecraft, Lovell glanced out of the side window of the command module.
It looks to me as though we are offending something. It's a gas of some sort.
Their second oxygen tank had also been damaged in the blast and was bleeding its contents into space. Soon, there would be nothing left for the astronauts to breathe, let alone to generate electricity. There was one chance for survival. Apollo 13's lunar module, Aquarius, had oxygen, fuel, and a descent engine that could be used to put them on a course back to Earth. The crew shut down the command module to preserve its tiny reserve of battery power for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. And all 3 of them climbed into the 2-person lunar module. Conditions were cramped and bitterly cold. NASA staff worked around the clock to solve countless engineering and navigation problems that put the astronauts' lives in constant danger. One of the most serious problems they faced was stopping the astronauts from being poisoned by their own exhaled carbon dioxide. The lunar module used round canisters of lithium hydroxide to filter carbon dioxide from the air. But there were only enough of these canisters to support 2 astronauts for 2 days. The command module used a similar system, but those canisters were square-shaped. Fortunately, to provide an emergency backup, NASA had developed a procedure during preparation for Apollo 8 to build an air purifier using a lithium hydroxide canister and items found in the spacecraft. The makeshift device was made of cardboard, tape, and an astronaut's sock. But it worked perfectly and removed the poisonous carbon dioxide from the cabin's atmosphere. Having survived the flight back to Earth, the crew faced re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. They climbed back into the command module and jettisoned Aquarius, which wouldn't survive re-entry.
We got the events, Mike. Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.
The command module had been powered down and left in freezing conditions for days. Its heat shield might have been cracked when the oxygen tank exploded, or its parachutes might have frozen solid. The astronauts were expected to be out of contact with Houston for 4 minutes during re-entry. But 4 minutes passed, and then 5, with no word from the crew. But after 6 agonizing minutes, Odyssey reappeared. The astronauts had survived. Apollo 13 failed to land on the moon, but against all the odds and through incredible determination and ingenuity, NASA brought Lovell, Hayes and Swaggart home safely. The mission became known as the successful failure.
Now, because of the successful return of the Apollo 13 astronauts, the faith and confidence of the public towards NASA was restored, and NASA continued with its lunar program with Apollo 14. Now, the crew of Apollo 14 included Alan Shepard, a veteran of Project Mercury, and the first U.S. astronaut in space. Then we have Stuart Roosa and Edgar Mitchell. So that was the crew of Apollo 14. And the next Apollo mission, that was Apollo 14, landed on the moon on January 31 of 1971 in the exact spot that Apollo 13 was supposed to explore. Alan Shepard led this expedition, where millions of viewers watched on television as the astronauts played golf and threw javelins on the moon. So with this, the faith of the public towards NASA was restored. So here is a photo of Alan Shepard playing golf on the lunar surface. So that was Apollo 14. As you could see here, Alan Shepard played golf on the lunar surface. So with the success of Apollo 14, NASA confidently continued with its lunar program with Apollo 15. Now, the crew of Apollo 15 included David Scott, Alfred Worden, and James Irwin. And Apollo 15 was the 4th mission to land men on the moon. And mga ka-spacers, it was the first mission to use a lunar rover to feature 3 EVAs and to launch a sub-satellite in lunar orbit. And siguro mga ka-spacers, magtataka kayo kung paano nagkasya yung lunar rover na yan sa lunar module. Now, here is a GIF photo, and you will be amazed, mga ka-spacers, on how they fitted that lunar rover inside the lunar module of Apollo 15. So, ganito mga ka-spacers, ganyan kung paano nagkasya yung lunar rover na yan sa lunar module ng Apollo 15. So, ang galing ng pagkakatiklop ng lunar rover na yan. So, isn't that fascinating, mga ka-spacers? Alright, and here is a GIF photo of that lunar rover. So, this increased the range of the astronauts in exploring the lunar surface.
The final 3 missions would be the most scientifically productive, and they were equipped with advanced hardware. Their upgraded lunar module had enough supplies to support astronauts for 3 days. New spacesuits and backpacks enabled moonwalks as long as 7 hours. And the new lunar rover allowed astronauts to explore much larger areas of the moon's surface. Meanwhile, the command module pilot conducted extensive surveys of the moon from orbit, using a new suite of cameras and scientific instruments. Dave Scott, on his 3rd spaceflight, would be the commander of Apollo 15. The crew made one of the biggest geological discoveries of the program, when they unearthed a chunk of anorthosite, a piece of the moon's primordial crust, 4.5 billion years old.
And mga ka-spacers, meron pang ginawa ang Apollo 15 astronauts. So if you will recall, if Alan Shepard played golf on the lunar surface in Apollo 14, Dave Scott conducted Galileo's famous hammer feather drop experiment on the moon during the Apollo 15 mission. So isn't that fascinating, mga ka-spacers, on how Dave Scott conducted Galileo's hammer feather experiment on the lunar surface. So mga ka-spacers, let's watch this famous experiment of Galileo as performed by Dave Scott on the lunar surface. Alright mga spacers, let's watch this.
Jim, we copied both solar wind and penetrometer drum in the ETB.
Not quite yet. I haven't put the solar wind in yet, but I will shortly. I want to watch this. Joe, you have a good picture there. I've got
Beautiful picture, Dave.
Well, in my left hand I have a feather. In my right hand a hammer. And I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity fields. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon, and I'll drop the 2 of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? Which proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
Superb.
Now, aside from David Scott performing that famous Galilean experiment on the lunar surface, Apollo 15 also deployed satellites in lunar orbit. So the so-called PFS or Particles and Field Sub-Satellites 1 and 2 were deployed from the Apollo 15 service module in lunar orbit. This is to study the plasma particles on the moon. So that was Apollo 15, and with the success of Apollo 15, NASA continued with Apollo 16 with John Young, Kim Mattingly, and Charles Duke as the crew of Apollo 16. And Apollo 16 was the second mission with a Lunar Roving Vehicle or LRV or the Lunar Rover that could transport 2 astronauts. The LRV or the Lunar Rover could also carry tools, scientific equipment, communications gear, and lunar samples. And did you know, mga ka-spacers, that Apollo 16 also was the first to use the moon as an astronomical observatory? Alright, and here is a photo of the lunar module, and this was taken by Charles Duke in the Descartes Highlands. This was the landing site of Apollo 16 on April 21 of 1972. Commander Young is to the right of the lunar module and directly behind the lunar roving vehicle. Thomas Mattingly remained in the command module and service module in lunar orbit. And here is a plastic encased photo of astronaut Charles Duke's family, placed on the lunar surface by Duke himself. Written on the other side is the message, "This is the family of astronaut Duke from planet Earth. Landed on the moon on April of 1972.
Apollo 16 was commanded by John Young, who had already flown to the moon on Apollo 10. The lunar module pilot was Charlie Duke, and the command module pilot would be Ken Mattingly, who had lost his place on Apollo 13 just days before the launch, and was finally getting his chance to fly in space. Young and Duke spent 3 days on the lunar surface, travelling great distances with the aid of the lunar rover. But now, budget cutbacks had brought the Apollo program to an early end. Apollo 17 would be its final flight.
Now, even though Apollo 16 was a big success, NASA has to end the Apollo lunar program because of budget cuts by the US government. So with that, NASA launches its last lunar mission, which is Apollo 17. Now, Apollo 17 was the final mission of NASA's Apollo lunar program, launched at 12:33 a.m. on December 7 of 1972, with a crew made up of Commander Eugene Cernan, Command Module Pilot Ronald Evans, and Lunar Module Pilot Harrison Schmitt. Now, the scientific objectives of Apollo 17 included the following. Number 1, geological surveying and sampling of materials and surface features in a pre-selected area of the Taurus-Littrow region. Number 2, deploying and activating surface experiments. And number 3, conducting in-flight experiments and photographic tasks during lunar orbit and trans-Earth coast. So those were the objectives of Apollo 17. And did you know, mga ka-spacers, that Apollo 17 hosted the first scientist astronaut to land on the moon? And that was Harrison Schmitt. And here is a photo of Harrison Schmitt doing some geologic survey on the lunar surface. So mga ka-spacers, that was Apollo 17. Apollo 17 was the last lunar mission of the Apollo program. So at this point, mga ka-spacers, let's watch this video of Apollo 17. Alright, mga ka-spacers, let's watch this.
On December the 7th, 1972, Apollo 17 prepared to depart. It was the only night launch of a Saturn V. The rocket's blazing exhaust plume lit up the sky at Cape Kennedy. The final mission was commanded by Gene Cernan. His command module pilot was Ron Evans, and the lunar module pilot was Harrison Schmitt. On this final mission, Schmidt represented a first. A professional geologist, he was the only scientist astronaut to walk on the moon. Apollo 17 landed at Taurus Littrow, the most geologically complex site yet visited. Cernan and Schmidt spent a total of 22 hours walking on the moon. They travelled 19 miles across its surface, and they collected more scientific data than any other mission. But after 3 days on the moon, it was time to leave. Cernan and Schmidt would be the last humans to walk on the moon in the 20th century. But as the Apollo program came to an end, NASA was preparing for new adventures in spaceflight.
So mga ka-spacers, that was Apollo 17. Apollo 17 was the last lunar mission, and there was no Apollo 18. Now, Apollo 18 manned moon landing program was cancelled for a variety of reasons, including changes in technical direction because NASA wanted to focus more on their Skylab program and the development of the space shuttle. And there were budget cuts by the US government. So that was the reason why Apollo 18 was cancelled. There was no Apollo 18. Kaya ko lang na-emphasize po ito mga ka-spacers kasi may napanood po ako na Hollywood film na ang title ay Apollo 18. Ngayon pinapalabas dun sa film na yan na there was a secret lunar mission na Apollo 18. So again mga ka-spacers, hindi po totoo yan. The last lunar mission was Apollo 17. And ang tanong mga ka-spacers, babalik ba tayo sa buwan? Will we ever go back to the moon? So the answer there mga ka-spacers is yes. NASA is now planning for a comeback to the moon with their Artemis lunar program. So yan po yung ating hihintayin, yung Artemis lunar missions na yan. Alright, so mga ka-spacers, I guess that's about it for our two-part episode on the history of Project Apollo. So shout out sa mga students ko from the STEM strand and shout out sa mga officers ko of the BEDAN Society of Young Astronomers. Shout out din po sa mga administrators ng San Beda University-Manila. And shout out sa mga kasuki natin out there, mga ka-spacers, sa inyong walang sawang pagsubaybay at pagtutok dito sa ating programang Space, the Final Frontier. So this is your ka-spacer and Space Commander Professor Jun Cajigal from the BEDAN Society of Young Astronomers saying, live long and prosper. So always stay safe mga ka-spacers. So goodbye everybody. See you in our next episode. Bye-bye. See you guys. See you mga ka-spacers.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone.